The body kept catching in the frozen ruts. Joe Miller had tied baling rope under the dead man's armpits and dragged him the last half-mile to the military police roadblock because he no longer trusted uniforms. The corpse wore an American field jacket, American leggings, American gloves, and boots that had carried him through 6 days of snow before Joe put a bullet through his throat north of Bütgenbach. A shaded lamp threw yellow light over the barrier, the ambulances idling behind it, and Joe himself limping behind the rope with frost on his hat brim. It was the evening of December 23rd, 1944. After a week of low cloud, the sky had finally broken open. Aircraft could be heard again over the Ardennes. Men on the road kept looking up, as if they had forgotten planes belonged to their side too. The clear weather should have felt like rescue. To Joe, it felt like the end of something that had started in his kitchen. The MP at the barrier came toward the body first. 2 riflemen followed him. Behind them, a driver muttered that they were stopping everyone now because the Germans had started coming through in stolen jeeps and American coats. Joe stopped dragging. The body rolled onto one shoulder. The MP crouched to reach for the dog tags, and Joe said, "Don't bother." He knelt, opened the jacket, and pulled free the second cord hidden under the shirt. Half of a German identification disc swung in the light. The MP rose and asked, "How did you know?" Joe looked down at the face. He did not say that his younger son had died for hearing one German word in the wrong place. He said, because when he thought nobody was listening, he prayed in German. "They tell me this was the 7th day," Joe said. "I remember it different. It was 2 nights before Christmas, and I killed the last friend I had left. 7 days earlier, he had still been a farmer. On the morning of December 16th, before the first shells reached the northern shoulder of the Ardennes, Joe was in the yard of his farm between Schoppen and Ondenval, splitting beechwood in air so cold the chips sounded like glass when they struck the snow. The place sat alone between the road and the timber. 1 house, 1 barn, a chicken run, and a shed where harness leather hung stiff as iron. Beyond the ridge country to the east, his oldest son, William, was serving with the 99th Infantry Division. Joe thought in chores. Water before ice, feed before dark, wood before night. In the Philippines, years earlier, he had learned that survival often arrived disguised as a small habit done on time. Thomas was at the chopping block when the first artillery reached them as a distant weight in the air. He was 14, thin and stubborn, carrying kindling barehanded because he thought gloves were for old men and babies. He looked east and said, "That's not practice." "No," Joe said. Inside, Joe laid out what he meant to take to William: socks, a scarf, 2 apples wrapped in newspaper, and a flask of apple brandy saved for Christmas. Thomas stood in the doorway watching him. "Can I come?" "No." "I can drive the mare." "No." "I can carry the bag." "You can keep the chickens alive." Thomas stayed there another moment. "Dad, in the Philippines, did you ever kill anybody?" Joe reached for his coat. "I was in places where men died." "That's not what I asked." Joe paused. "I carried 1 man out of a ravine once, 3 days on my back. That's what I remember." "Who was he?" "A friend." "You still know him?" There had been a letter in 1938 from Caspar Jung, a man who had gone back to Germany for family business and never come back out. Joe had burned it after reading it. "Not anymore," he said. When he stepped onto the porch with the parcel and his rifle case, he stopped. At the edge of the timber, between 2 firs loaded with snow, something upright had moved and gone still. Not a deer. A man who knew enough not to move twice. Thomas came beside him. "What is it?" "Nothing I can prove." By noon, the The artillery was nearer. By afternoon, the roads had begun to fill with stragglers, trucks, and rumors. Germans in force. Tanks where tanks should not be. Men in American uniforms who were not Americans. Joe heard enough to decide not to leave at once. A little after 3, a jeep with a white star came up the lane, followed by a truck with canvas sides. 4 men got down from the jeep and 3 from the truck. They wore American winter clothing, carried American weapons, and moved with the worn authority of soldiers who had not slept. One of them, a broad man with sergeant's stripes and a scarf wrapped high on his neck, called out, "Mr. Miller!" The man pointed at the mailbox. "Lucky guess. We're trying to get west before dark. Need hot water if you got it, and maybe the backtrack through the woods." Reasonable words, every one of them. Joe's eyes moved over the group, mud on the wheels, snow crust on coat hems. One man holding his rifle a little too carefully, like a borrowed tool. Another scanning the barn, the shed, the downstairs window. None of it proved anything. Thomas came out onto the porch. The sergeant smiled at him. "You know the roads, son?" "Better than him," Thomas said. The men laughed. The sound was almost right. Joe kept them at the side door, not inside. He fetched hot water. Thomas, pleased to be useful, went with one of the men to point out where the lane met the timber track. Joe was carrying the kettle back from the stove when he heard it. "Schnell," one of the soldiers said softly outside. The word was barely louder than a boot in snow. It was enough. Joe set the kettle down too hard. Through the window he saw Thomas stop walking, just a small freezing in the shoulders. The soldier beside him saw the boy's face and understood at once. When the men left 10 minutes later, they left with thanks and the right-hand signals and the same careful performance they had arrived with. Joe turned to Thomas. The boy spoke first. "He said it in German." "I know." "They heard me hear it." "I know. What do we do?" Joe went to the window. "We stay awake." Night came early. Joe banked the stove low, put out the front lamp, and sat in the dark kitchen with the rifle across his knees. Thomas was supposed to stay on the floor beneath the table. Instead, he knelt by the shutter. Nothing moved for an hour. Then someone knocked. Joe did not answer. The second knock came louder. Then the sergeant's voice. "Mr. Miller? Blew a tire on the road. Mind if we borrow more hot water?" Joe motioned for Thomas to stay down. The voice outside lost its cheer. "Open up!" The first shot came through the window by the stove. The second tore the latch off the door. Joe fired once through the wood before the door burst inward. The room filled with men and muzzle flash. Joe got one in the chest and another in the neck. Then a bullet hit his left leg below the knee and spun him half sideways. He fell against the table, reached for the bolt, lost it, found it again. Thomas ran. He made 2 steps toward the back door before the sergeant caught him by the collar and dragged him into the center of the kitchen. Joe on the floor saw everything from stove height. The pistol at the boy's temple, the 2 dead intruders on the boards, another soldier covering the room, and the look on the sergeant's face. A look from another country entirely, from rain and vines and heat instead of cold. The sergeant said to Thomas, "You heard me this afternoon." Thomas could not speak. The pistol pressed harder. "Did you hear me?" Joe got the bolt home. The rifleman saw the movement and fired. The round hit the table leg. Joe fired back from the floor, and the rifleman went down against the cupboard. For one instant, the sergeant looked at Joe instead of Thomas. Joe felt recognition before he knew why. Then the sergeant shot Thomas in the head. Joe fired again. The shot struck the wall by the sergeant's shoulder. He was already moving, already shouting in German, already gone into the yard with the 2 survivors. Engines coughed. Then the lane swallowed them again. Joe tried to stand. His wounded leg folded. He crawled instead. Thomas was still alive when Joe reached him. Only just. Blood ran dark over the boards. Joe put one hand under the boy's head and one over the wound as if pressure might keep a life inside him by force. "Dad," Thomas whispered. "I'm here." The sergeant, after the first shot, he said the prayer wrong. German. Then he was gone. Joe sat on the kitchen floor with his son in his arms until the stove sank low and the room turned from orange to black. By dawn, the farm looked abandoned by history. Joe wrapped Thomas in a blanket and buried him behind the chicken run, where the ground was shallow enough to break. It took most of the morning because the cold had gone deep into the earth. When the grave was covered, he stood over it, with William's parcel still strapped and ready on the chair inside. Socks, scarf, apples, apple brandy. Things for one son, waiting beside the fresh dirt of the other. He could have ridden east then. He could have found William and handed him Thomas's dog tag and let the army chase the men who had done it. Instead, he took the tag, strapped on his rifle, and turned west into the trees. He would tell William his brother was dead. But first he would know who had killed him, and whether the face he had almost recognized on his kitchen floor belonged to the same man Joe had once carried out of a jungle ravine half a world away. The first sign was not a footprint, it was a road sign turned off true. Joe found it where the secondary track forked near a stand of fir. The arrow that ought to have sent traffic toward Ligneville now pointed into timber and drift. Nearby, in a ditch, lay a field telephone wire cut clean through. Farther on, beneath a bush, he found ration paper and a strip torn from a new American jacket. That was enough to tell him the men from his farm were doing what the rumors said these infiltrators did. Cut communications, twist directions, turn the rear into a maze. By noon, he found the military policeman. Howard was in a snow ditch beside a wrecked motorcycle, trying to bandage his own shoulder with fingers too numb to tie a knot. He looked up when Joe stepped from the trees and raised his carbine halfway. "If you're a German," Howard said, "you missed your chance while I was busy dying." Joe knelt, tied the dressing, and asked, "Roadblock?" 2 miles east. Was. Howard winced. "Men came through in our own jackets yesterday and had half the column saluting them. By the time anybody asked the right questions, my captain was dead." Joe pointed west. "They went that way." Howard studied him. Joe told him enough. American uniforms, German spoken at the wrong time, his boy dead. Howard listened, then said, "Then we're following the same ghosts." All afternoon they moved through the timber with Joe reading the snow and Howard reading the military meaning of what Joe found. The trail was broken grammar. Fresh impressions over older ones, places where a truck had stopped, where men had dismounted, where one had vomited black bread and coffee substitute instead of American beans. Howard crouched over the mess and said, "German. How do you know?" "Because I haven't seen an American soldier in this weather throw up black bread." Toward dusk, they found 2 dead signalmen near a culvert, the field telephone cart tipped over, the line severed. Howard covered their faces. "Every mile they stay loose. Every officer on this side of the ridge gets jumpier. Men start shooting first. Convoys stop moving. Guns don't get shells. That's what this is for." Joe looked at the cut wire. "My son heard one word. It cost him his life." Howard hesitated, then said, "At Bognes they say 80-odd of ours were shot in a field after surrendering. If half the rumors are true, your boy wasn't the first cost. Just yours." That night they built a fire too small to warm anything but their hands. Joe had not meant to tell Howard about the Philippines. He did it because the trail had begun to narrow in a direction he did not want to see. "It was Mindanao," he said. "Patrol work. Wet hills, bad maps. I was 22. He was 21. Casper Jung." Howard turned his head. "The man you carried out?" Joe nodded. "And you think your sergeant is him?" "I think I knew his face before I knew why." By morning, the group had split. Joe saw it in the scuffed snow around an alder stand. Another element had peeled south with the truck. A lighter party had continued north. The leading man favored his left leg. Not enough for most eyes. Enough for Joe's. A mile later, the snow gave them what the men had failed to hide. Behind brush lay 2 overshoes, a length of rope, and a torn family photograph. A man in civilian clothes stood holding a girl of about 12. Joe stared at the face. Older, heavier through the jaw. Still him. Howard saw the change in Joe's eyes. That him? Joe nodded once. They found 2 men from the southern element at a shed, stripping a dead American of his dry socks. Joe circled through the furs, came in behind them, and put one down with the rifle butt. Howard shot the other in the thigh and finished the argument with the muzzle at his cheek. The living prisoner spoke English first, then German when Howard pressed the wound with a boot. "Name," Howard said. The man spat blood into the snow. "You know what we are. Say it." A pause. Then, bitterly, "Stielau." Howard's face changed at the word. "Leader," Howard said. The prisoner looked at Joe, then away. "Jung, Feldwebel Jung." The name did not strike Joe like a bullet. Bullets were clean. It struck like rot under a plank. Howard kept asking, where were they headed? How many remained? What mattered now? The man gave it up in pieces. The main effort had stalled in traffic, artillery, and wrong roads. The northern teams were to keep doing what small teams still could: misdirect traffic, kill signal posts, slip through roadblocks, and reach the rear of the American guns near the ridge. "Why the girl?" Howard asked, showing him the photograph. The prisoner laughed once through his teeth. "Insurance. The sergeant wouldn't shoot children unless he had to. Others would." They left the prisoner where someone might find him, or the cold might claim him first. They took the photograph and the knowledge that Caspar Jung had gone north with 2 men and a captured child. The ambush at the farmhouse crossroads came before noon. The truck rolled in under a white star caked in mud and snow. Joe and Howard waited in a hayloft. The girl was visible under the canvas in back, wrists tied, eyes emptied by too much fear. Joe let the truck come almost beneath them before he fired into the driver. Howard hit the man beside him. The truck slewed sideways and stalled. A 3rd German stumbled out shouting broken American slang. Joe shot him before he cleared the door. It lasted 20 seconds. Howard cut the girl free. Joe searched the dead. No Caspar. No left leg drag. The girl spoke in fragments. The leader had left before dawn with 2 men. North. A more valuable road. More valuable confusion. Then Howard stepped into the open to search the tree line. Joe heard the shot before he saw him fall. Howard sat down hard in the snow. Blood spread over his coat in a shape the dressings in his pack would never cure. Joe got the girl under cover first. By the time he crawled back, Howard was already trying to breathe around damage that would not be repaired. Howard clawed at the radio on his belt and shoved it toward him. Got it working. Joe took the set. Howard's lips had gone blue. "Weather's breaking. Once the air opens, everything on roads gets seen. Means your man stays in trees and ditches. Means he goes where footmen can still hurt us." Joe held pressure on the wound. It did not matter. The girl had told Joe one more thing. Before leaving, Caspar had crouched in front of her, held the torn photograph a moment and said in English, "Tell your father if he sees Joe Miller, say I'm looking for him on the 7th day." Howard saw the answer in Joe's face anyway. "Then he knows you're behind him." "Yes." "Good," Howard whispered. "Then he won't be looking somewhere else." He died before the sky cleared. Joe buried him shallow, beside the farmhouse wall. The girl stood without speaking, and held the photograph while he worked. When he finished, he took Howard's radio, Howard's map, the girl, and started north toward Bütgenbach. He was no longer hunting only the man who had killed Thomas. That man was moving toward the roads feeding the guns behind Elsenborn Ridge, toward the rear of the 99th, toward William. The 23rd came with light. The real light arrived toward afternoon when the cloud ceiling broke and blue showed over the forest. Joe heard aircraft first. Then the men on the roads heard them too, and every American face he passed lifted with the same startled hunger. The traffic east of Bütgenbach was jammed with artillery tractors, ambulances, engineers, replacements, and men with feet so ruined by cold and wet that they limped on numb stumps inside frozen boots. Joe kept to the edge of the movement with the girl behind him and the radio under his arm. Howard's map had given him two likely routes a small foot party might use to skirt the checkpoints. The second brought him through a drainage swale into the rear of a temporary road control point where soldiers of the 99th, a few MPs, and drivers from half a dozen units had been gathered by confusion and necessity. That was where he saw William. His oldest son stood by an overturned ammunition crate with a bandage around one hand and a cigarette between his fingers. Frost had burned his cheeks raw. He was listening to a man in an American overcoat giving directions with a confidence Joe recognized before he saw the face fully. Casper. The coat was right. The helmet was right. The cigarette in his fingers was wrong. Not the cigarette itself, but the way he held it, pinched close, like a man in wet jungle trying to hide the glow through leaves. Joe saw in one line of sight the kitchen floor, Thomas under the stove light, Mindanao rain on broad leaves, and William standing in range of all of it. He had time only to choose. He fired at the man beside Casper first. The round took the false American through the ear and dropped him into the road before anybody understood the shot. Then the checkpoint burst apart. Real Americans dove for ditches. Drivers screamed. Somebody shouted that Germans were in the line. William turned, saw his father on the bank above the road, and for one beat did not understand why he was there. Casper did. He shoved one real soldier aside, drew his pistol, and fired once toward the bank. William, not Casper, jerked and spun. The cigarette flew from his hand. He fell against the crate and slid into the snow. Joe was off the bank before the echoes were gone. He reached William under a curtain of shouted orders and misdirected return fire. The wound was high in the shoulder, bloody, but not immediately mortal. William was trying to rise on anger alone. "Dad," he said. Joe pulled Thomas's dog tag from his pocket and closed it into William's good hand. William looked at the tag, then at his father's face. Understanding came fast and cruel. "When?" "Night of the 16th. William shut his eyes once. "Who?" "The man I'm going after now." William grabbed his sleeve with bloody fingers. "Don't leave me like this." Joe bent close. "I'm not leaving you. I'm keeping him from coming back through the line." A medic was already running toward them. Joe pressed William's hand once, then stood and went after Casper into the trees. The girl followed until the first shots ahead sent her flat. Joe turned, pointed her back toward the road, and vanished among the firs. Casper's retreat line was disciplined even now. Joe found brass, a boot scrape, a broken branch, then the left drag track again, lighter now, controlled. The forest thickened into an abandoned logging camp, cut stumps, stacked cordwood, collapsed sheds, drainage ditches rimmed in shadow. He slowed. That saved him. The first flanker rose from behind a woodpile on Joe's right. Joe saw the muzzle, dropped behind a stump, and let the burst chew bark over his shoulder. Then he cut across the shooter's expectation instead of away from it. At 5 feet, the weapon was too long to help. Joe jammed the barrel aside, drove the front sight into the man's face, and fired once through his coat and ribs. The second flanker came from the left drainage cut. Joe heard the snow compress under him, spun, and fired too quickly. He missed. The German fired back. The bullet tore Joe's sleeve without flesh. Then they were both behind cover, both listening. Joe remembered Mindanao then. Rain on leaves, mud, leeches, Casper cursing because the things on his legs bothered him more than bullets. The memory bought Joe timing. He pulled off his cap and tossed it over the stump to his right. The German fired at the movement. Joe came low from the left and shot him through the throat. When the camp fell silent again, only one set of steps remained. "Joe!" Casper called from somewhere ahead. "Come out!" Joe said. Casper stepped from behind a half-collapsed saw shed into the open lane between the wood stacks. He held a pistol at his side, not raised. Grey at the temples, one cheek scarred, left leg stiff under the American trousers. "I knew you'd get this far," Casper said. Joe kept the rifle on his chest. "You knew me in my kitchen." "Not at first. In the dark, when you worked the bolt with your palm open. In the Philippines, I carried you out." "You did. And in Belgium, you shot my boy." Casper closed his eyes once. "I shot your boy." "I am sorry," he said. Joe's finger tightened on the trigger. "You should be dead already." "I have been dead a long time." Casper looked past him toward the road. "Germany is lost. You know that. I know that. But lost is not the same as finished. My wife and daughter are west of Cologne. If your armies get there first, they live. If the roads break and the wrong people get there first, maybe they don't. So I do what can still be done by 3 men in stolen coats. You murder boys in kitchens. I murder anything that costs me time." Joe hated how perfectly he understood that sentence. "Do not make me cleaner than I am," Casper said. "I know what I did in your house." "Then why talk?" "Because once, when I was 21 and half dead, you put me on your back and walked me out of a ravine. Because when I saw you in the kitchen, I knew what the world had turned into. Because I hoped you might miss." Thomas didn't. No. The engines were nearer now. American. Heavy. "Your older son," Casper said. "Did he live?" "Yes." "Good." Then the girl ran into the clearing. She came from behind the drainage cut, breath tearing in her throat, the torn photograph still in one hand. She saw Casper, saw Joe, and stopped in the lane between them. Casper's whole face changed, not into innocence, into recognition. "Go," he said to her in German. She did not move. Behind the camp, engines broke fully into hearing. Searchlights or headlamps swung through the far trees. Joe had a clean line for half a second. He also had the girl in that line. If he fired through her risk, he would become the man Casper had been in Joe's kitchen, a father deciding that somebody else's child was acceptable cost. Joe lowered the muzzle 1 inch. Casper saw it. Something like gratitude passed over his face, and then he did the only thing left that he still owned. He raised his pistol toward Joe. The machine gun from the lead American half-track opened before either man fired again. The burst crossed the lane and tore into Casper from shoulder to hip. He jerked once, then folded backward into the snow. The girl screamed and dropped. Joe reached her first and shoved her behind a stump as American voices shouted through the camp. When Joe rose, Casper was still alive. He lay on his side with the pistol under him and blood soaking through the field jacket. His eyes tracked Joe with effort. On the second attempt, he managed one word. Danke. It was the same word he had gasped in Mindanao when Joe lowered him from his back beside a stream and told him he was too stubborn to die. Then it had meant relief. Here it meant something Joe would spend the rest of his life refusing to explain too neatly. Joe reached into his coat, took out Thomas's dog tag, and put it in Casper's hand. He closed the fingers over it one by one. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Simply, weight returned to the man who had added it to the world. Then Joe stood and turned toward the American lights. "Friendly?" he shouted. "Friendly, you fools!" They nearly shot him anyway. Later, after the questions and the body under the lamp, Joe found William in a hospital tent on Christmas Eve. The tent was hot with stoves and sickness. Wet socks hung on lines overhead. Medics moved between cots with scissors and enamel cups. Outside, the guns were farther away than they had been in days. William was asleep under morphine and exhaustion, his shoulder wrapped thick. Joe sat beside the cot with the apple brandy on his knee, the bottle that had left the farm for Christmas, and reached Christmas by a route no one in that house would have imagined. The girl sat on the crate beside him and leaned carefully against his arm. After a while, she fell asleep there too, trusting him because she had run out of choices and because he had not used her to finish what he wanted finished. Joe opened the bottle and drank once. A young infantryman on the next cot watched him and managed a thin smile. "Sir," he said, "you with some unit?" Joe looked at the boy, at William, at the sleeping girl, at the stove, at the rows of thawing boots by the canvas wall. Then he shook his head. "I grow apples," he said. Outside the tent, the snow had begun again. Through a gap in the canvas, Joe could see it falling in trucklight, covering ruts and the edges of new graves. Somewhere under that snow lay an unnamed German in an American jacket with Thomas's tag in his dead hand. Somewhere else lay Howard beside a farmhouse wall and Thomas behind a chicken run. Years later, when men asked Joe how many Germans he had killed in the Bulge, he found he had no use for the arithmetic. What he knew was smaller and harder. On the seventh day, the sky opened. The planes came back. The roads came back. Joe Miller found the last friend he had left and did not bring him home. For a long time, he thought that was the whole story. Age taught him otherwise. On that day, he had not only killed, he had also kept one son from dying under a false American voice. He had kept one orphaned girl from standing forever between two fathers with guns. He had kept himself from finishing his grief by becoming the exact thing he was hunting. Snow covered the rest. It covered the tracks in the logging camp, the blood on the kitchen boards, the turned road signs, the cut field wire, the dead at the culvert, the dead at Ardennes, the named and unnamed, the Germans in American coats, and the Americans who died believing them. It did not cover what he had learned. Uniforms could be stolen. Roads could be turned. A man could save another man's life in one country and lose his son to him in another. Roots stayed where they were, under everything, waiting for weather bad enough to show them. On Christmas Eve of 1944, Joe sat beside William's cot with the bottle in his hand and the girl asleep on his shoulder, while soldiers somewhere outside sang in voices too tired to be musical. The song drifted through snow and canvas, English blending with other languages the war had dragged into one frozen patch of Belgium. Then he looked through the tent flap at the falling snow and kept watch over the living.